Yeah, I definitely, some of the chapters were more challenging to get through
My
than
book?
yeah.
Okay. I had no idea what we're talking about. I'm like, okay, because some people just read articles, some people
No,
actually.
no, I read your book. So it was yeah, um I think the chapter with your interaction with your uncle.
My most violent chapter, of course. But I really decided that I had to tell the truth,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah. And then you were very open with your, I guess, your mother's situation. Um, I think have you do you feel like you've reconciled with how your mother handled things? Because there was a few things that kind of stood out with what you said about just kind of the way your mother handled your situations growing up.
Um, yeah, I had a lot of therapy. I mean, but my mother was also 20 years old with three children
Hmm.
and putting herself working two jobs and putting herself through school. So I don't think it was like the normal, nothing normal about it. It just was what it was. And her, um, because she had been raised partly with her parents, partly in an orphanage, partly, you know, she was on her own from the age of 12, working as a housekeeper to go to school, to pay to go to school. So I don't think like there was a lot of like social emotional intelligence in terms of child rearing. But at the same time, and I don't know that I put this in the book, which is, she exposed me to a lot of things that actually changed my life. And I grew up in a house where I always say this: there wasn't a lot of food, but we lived in like a library. My mother passed 2 years ago, and when she did, she was in a PhD program, so she had like gotten her education, and yeah, and I also think, and she acknowledges that she may have had some mental illness issues, some bipolar spectrum issues that went untreated. But I think that in that time period, lots of things went untreated. Um, so yeah, I mean, I grew up. I had, I'm a mother. Like, um, I raised my child very differently than I was raised, of course. But I also was older. I had one kid. I really, I think becoming a mother myself wound up healing a lot for me. So, but you can get into specifics if you like.
It's interesting you mentioned about the books. There was a part where you describe how your mother would curl with hardbound books in her bed. I don't know if you remember writing that part or
Oh,
no. Okay.
but it's true.
Where she, I guess, she found a lot of security in the books that your mother had. I guess probably something that she was able to control, just having the books in the house or whatnot. And
Yeah,
um,
I have so many books in my house that it's a problem.
uh,
I'm looking at a library here. They're upstairs. Like I places everywhere. It's bad.
that's a good problem to have. You said something in the very beginning of the book, a note from the author, which I found interesting. Um, you said, let's see, I know of many hospital programs and inpatient recovery programs that work miracles, but I did not have the financial means or the health insurance to be able to afford those, nor would I have trusted specialists to help me. But that has more to do with where I come from than their abilities. For a long time, allowing myself to become dependent on therapists and other professionals was foreign to me and even worse, shameful. I had to grow up and learn to leave behind my ignorant beliefs that as a Black woman, I needed to suffer in silence, that somehow my legacy of strong independent ancestors did not allow me to lean on anyone outside of my community. Is that a would you say that was a kind of a cultural belief? Or was that something that in your specific world that you had a belief of having a hard time depending on other people for help?
Oh, I think it's absolutely cultural. I think it's also Socioeconomic. I think the less educated we are, but that's not true because I've been speaking to people who come from a lot of education. Like, I don't know if you're aware of like um, the Tuskegee experiment, where they, you know, got this subsection of black men and they shot them with syphilis or
Oh,
gonorrhea to try out the medications. And so we've been, or the Henrietta Lacks experiment, well, I think like we've been used as guinea pigs, and so there's not a lot of trust. Also, you're talking about environments where social workers come in and find out you're not doing everything perfectly, or whatever, and sometimes it's absolutely right, and other times it's not. Your children are taken away. I just don't think that there's a lot of trust in our community, and especially because most of these most of the charge is led by white people, right? Like, so I grew up in an all black community in Bed-Stuy, which is no longer that way, but in Brooklyn. But I did not grow up with this belief that that it was safe to trust outside of our community, and often that it was safe to trust outside of our home. So yeah.
is that something that needs to change, or how, and if it needs to change, how do you begin implementing those changes where people
you know
can start to trust?
I'm talking to a bunch of people now about that, um, who are really interested in making change. And I also feel like in the time since I started recovery, there are a lot more Black therapists. There are a lot more Black eating disorder specialists. There's just more people have gotten involved. People, there's more education about growing up with childhood trauma and the fallout of that, and how trauma affects your body, your future, how you see yourself in the world, and that trauma does not just leave your body if you do not work through it. So I think like we're I'm writing a new book about it. I mean, I'm like more of a self-help book, but I think I'm really addressing trauma and how um, we have to give ourselves permission to get the support we need around it so
Mhm.
that we can move through it.
Yeah, I think that's something that I think the world's going to have to work through for the rest of time, because with the culture changing so much comes new types of trauma that comes with it.
Yeah.
Uh, in I'll just read another thing you said. In on page 27, you said, my mother was afraid to show affection for fear it would weaken our defenses and the world would chew us out and chew us up and spit us out. She believed her restraint would ultimately make us strong. She had no idea that hugs and verbal professions of love would have given us warrior strength and power. I guess when did you, I guess what point in your life did you realize that love and affection would have made you stronger versus the more of the restraint of love that your mother gave you?
I think going into finding an eating disorder support group, lots of hugs, um, you know, becoming an adult, having friends, letting down my guard, and also understanding that like that wasn't necessarily normal, seeing my friends like with very affectionate relationships with their parents. I mean, I also saw some of that growing up. It wasn't, I had aunts who were very affectionate with their children. Um, but I do think that that is a belief in our community, and not just the Black community, but there are other minority communities, um, and probably not just minority communities, that believe like I'm gonna make you strong, right? And having kind of like a backward idea of what that entails. I have a daughter, and she's got all this like strength and confidence and self emotional intelligence, um and she's just very, and she knows she's very loved by her parents. Like, it's not, I think when you have two parents who love you and accept you and really just, you know show up for you, you move through the world differently.
Mhm. And
You
there's
know, because
always,
you have that to fall back on.
yeah, exactly. You always feel free to, if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world, but instead you have parents that you can go to learn from those mistakes. Um, I guess so. How, I guess the importance of a two-parent household, it seems now that it's very common for kids to grow up in a one-parent household more so, or if it is a two-parent household, it seems like there's an absence of the parent's presence in that child's life.
I don't know because I think like I'm around a lot of households who all do it differently, right? I'm around one parent households that are rocking it, that are just like really showing up for themselves and showing up for their children. And, I think it also, again, has to do with self, um, and also, I guess, with, socioeconomics, right? How tired are you? How much do you have to give? How much do you have left over? um, how young were you when you had your kids? How many kids did you have? How much support did you get? I mean, I think like it's not as simplistic. I would never say that raising a child in a one parent household, you know, is um, such a deficit, because I know people raised in two parent households that were shit shows, that were nightmares, that were, not safe. And I don't mean like that there was sexual abuse, but there were other kinds of pressure and abuse or expectations, or, you know, I don't know. I don't, um, I just, that's not a banner I carry that I'm like, now, that being said, I wish I grew up in a two parent household with two loving, healthy parents. You know, I don't think, um, growing up in a household with my particular father, who I think is like was great in a lot of ways and educated and smart, but emotionally like stunted and absent. I don't know that that would have been as helpful for me, because I don't think his capacity of was great.
Mm.
And I'm close to my brother who grew up in a household, so I know like I probably dodged a bullet.
So
So
would you agree that a kid needs to have a safe community though to grow up in?
yes, yeah, absolutely. And until what happened to my uncle, until my uncle, raped me at 12, I did have a big extended family that felt, you know, while my mother didn't seem that interested in food, all my relatives were. So, and I was around them very often, and I felt like taken care of in a different way when I was with them.
Mm. And how do you, I guess in your opinion, how do you build a community for, I guess, your kids so that they grow up in a, I guess, a safe environment?
Oh my God, that's such my okay. So I think, like, I don't know if I said this in the book, but there was a lot of, I think, based on my mother's like kind of like spectrum bipolar thing, there was a lot of change. So I moved something like 9 times. So there wasn't a lot of stability that way.
Mm.
I went to a lot of different schools. I moved states, and people would say, "Oh, are you in the military?" And I'd be like, "No, we're not," because my mother was also a political activist. Um, so for me, like my daughter went to a preschool. She still has friends from preschool. She went to an elementary school. She still has friends from the elementary school. She went to junior high school. She still has a friend, and now she's in college. And so, I think like not her having like the stability of community, and also every sport, every art, every piano class, everything she did, she like a lot of my close friends are parents that my child, you know, oh, our kids did soccer for 2 or 3 years together. Okay, now then we became close friends. Oh, you know, we all were founding parents at a school, so now like we became so I think that a lot of that was a sense of community, and also raising her in a household where kids came over from when she was little. They always came over, and sleepovers with 10 girls, like, so I think like that built I think that built a sense of community. To have, like I was the parent who would get the call in school, oh, there's not the snack parent didn't show up. Can you come and bring the snacks? I'm a writer, so I was able to come, so I think I just went out of my way to be an available parent, and I was able to, again, that falls into like the socioeconomic category. I set myself up so that I would be able to work from home and show up.
Mm.
And it was a lot of sacrifice, but I think it was worth it.
And for people that are in that I guess economic standing where they just don't have a lot of money, but it's very clear that they need therapy, they need counseling, they need more
Health
mental
care.
health. Yeah.
Okay, so
What would be your suggestion? So
here's my suggestion. Every city, every town, and now that we are all stuck in our homes, a lot of teletherapy is online. So, like when I started in recovery, I live in Los Angeles. So we have like a couple of places like the Southern California Counseling Center or the Maple Center, and they do a sliding scale. And so, I remember going to this intake therapy and these are my issues. And not really identifying that I came from high levels of trauma. Like, I don't know if you know about the ACEs test, the adult, um, wait, advanced childhood experience test,
mhm.
which quantifies trauma. Well, I have like a score of 8. I know that. I just went to this therapy intake, and they were like, yeah, I met with this therapist, and she goes, yeah, you can come twice a week. And I was like, oh, and they charged me $5 a session, and I went twice a week. And then when this therapist left and went on her own, because it was like more like a one of the best therapy training centers in the country, but they're everywhere. So there are places you can go and get help for low to no cost. And this saved my life. Like, it helped me identify my trauma. It helped me move it out of my body. It helped me and I also had a support group, and I also had a spiritual community because I grew up in an atheist household. Um, and I think it was like, that's the Trinity, right? Like, you need spiritual support. It doesn't have to be church. Like, I don't it you need mental health support, which is therapy, and you need community, right? So these are like the three components that you need in order to really recover for a lifetime.
Mm.
So I still have a community. I you know I've gone in and out of therapy based on where my life is at the moment. It feels very safe. It feels amazing. Like that 50-minute hour, to grow up thinking like that makes you weak. I'm like, oh, I've been bamboozled because this is amazing. And my child went to a school where they had um, a class called life skills, where you had a talking stick and you talked about your feelings, right? Like what's going on. And it was supposed to be like, and it's a safe space, and nobody talks about what anyone talks about when they leave the room. I mean, I'm like, what? So from 6th grade, she learned to express herself, and not just academically, but to really get to the emotional core of what's going on with you.
Mm.
So
How do you teach your kids about body image? I did an interview with Dr. Jennifer Conzen a few months ago. She's a clinical psychologist who's also a sex therapist. You know, she does sexual addiction therapy. And so we had talked a little bit about body image a little bit. I guess, what is your take? How do you teach that to your kids about body image?
So I had two stepdaughters and my daughter, and they all have different bodies, clearly. Like, so I think, okay, first of all, you are, as a parent, you are your child's first superhero, right? Like, you're on that pedestal. And when you start like messing with your own body in front of your child, right? Oh, I need to go on a diet. I need to, they learn from you. Like, oh, if my mother, who's my superhero, isn't enough, then maybe I'm not enough.
Mm,
So I do think it's like eating disorders go from generation to generation, right? Like they're passed down. So how you talk to yourself is not just does not just affect you, but it affects your child and how they think of themselves. So your relationship with food. If you're I gave a talk at a high school recently, and there were, okay, not recently because COVID was recently, so I guess it was in November. But there were kids in the class who were like, I've never seen my mother eat anything other than salad. So imagine the guilt and shame a child feels when they reach for a burger,
mm.
right? Like, I do think it's about teaching your kids balance, just like everything else, and that food is not like the devil. Like I try to, I don't have like oh, that's a good food, that's a bad food. Yes, we know if you eat donuts all day, every day, that, that's going to be a problem. If you eat fried food all the time, that's going to raise your cholesterol. Like, there are things, but within balance, like, eat it. It's like, it's food. So I think like how you feel about your body, um, uh, I don't think you should either be obsessive, like, oh, I have to work out every day to keep fit. Like, that's also a little bit of like too much for a child to take on, right? Like, um, so I think like getting to a place where you're okay with your body, it's, bodies are magical. They can do so many amazing things. And I think like that's the messaging. Yeah, I keep saying but yeah, I think that's the messaging. Just they're going to learn from you. So you got to think about like your self-talk. What are you saying to yourself? Well, what messaging are you passing on to your children?
Mm.
um yeah, I think that's the most one of the most important things you can do as a parent, is love yourself so that they feel that.
Is did you ever have an insecurity that one of your kids one day will read your book and know everything that's happened to you?
No,
No.
I did when I was younger, when my children, yeah, when my daughter and my nephew, who I helped raise, were younger. I worried, like, oh my god, it's traumatic. But I mean, so I have there's a therapist who I have done workshops with, and I know her. She lives in Canada, and I know her kid. And when her daughter was like 15, she called me up and she goes, oh my god, my daughter read your book. And I was like, that must have been a long conversation. I don't think my daughter has any interest in reading my book. um they're not interested. They know what I do. They've heard me like talk to women I work with about, different things. When my daughter was in middle school, she came to me to talk to me about a friend who was struggling with an eating disorder. I mean, she knows it's what I do because I'll travel to college. I'll be like, oh, I have to go to, Poughkeepsie to talk at this college. I have to go, so they're everyone's aware of what I do. Like, I'm also a writer having nothing to do with this business, but I don't have any shame around it. So I think that that's what they pick up on. Like, I'm really into recovery and recovering and not recovering perfectly. Like, I don't think there's any perfect way to do this. And I think that that's the first step in getting through disordered eating or an eating disorder.
I hope this isn't too personal of a question. Has recovery been difficult with COVID and just with the social tension in our country and just with the shelter in place?
Um, so here's yes, yeah, yeah, like yes. I've live in Los Angeles. You know, one of the biggest marches was blocked from my house. Um, I, you know, it hit a lot of emotional court like places for me. I ran into one of the people from my support group after. I didn't go to a meeting to a I'm not a meeting. I didn't go to a march, but I went close to one and watched, and I like cried for 2 days. Right, like it's very emotional. I also, because I have surrounded myself with like-minded people, I'm on two text chains with a lot of women. I'm on one text chain with 10 Black women in recovery. I'm on text chain, like in all of, I'll just say it, all of the white people in my life that I'm close to are allies. Like they're my people. So I think like that's important. I think it's important also sheltering in place. I can go for walks. I live in a very walkable neighborhood. So I think I've definitely had some ups and downs during this time and some, you know, emotional deserts, but I have a lot of support. I'm not, you know, I'm, my eating disorder is pretty, like, I'm in recovery. That's such a deep commitment to me that I've lost parents, I've gotten sick, I've been in the hospital, I've gone through a divorce. Like, I've gone through a lot with an eating, and you just, you know, you surround yourself with enough support so that you're not alone and isolated. And I think, and also there's a lot of recovery on Zoom, so I'm able to still have a community of support and of like-minded people who are like, we still got to get through this, you know, at one day at a time. We still have to do this. So, uh, but I would be lying if I said it wasn't hard, and it wasn't. It wasn't painful, and it wasn't painful to have Black children who are suddenly like, who not suddenly, but who are really looking at the world we're in.
Hmm. And how do you, I don't know if you may have answered this question a few minutes ago. How do you prepare your kids for the world that we live in? Because the times are a little bit chaotic.
Um, well, you have the talk when they start driving. Everybody has the talk, you know, about how to respond if you're pulled over. You have that talk. You have, I, I, I don't know. I think there's a constant reality. There's news. There's like, you know, I have a daughter who goes to college in Vermont, right? She goes to college with a lot of international students, and she's dealt with things, and people saying things like, "So, what kind of soda do Black people drink?" It's like, "What?" She's like, "What? What are you asking me?" So, I there's I think there's not one thing or one conversation, right? There's just showing up, suiting up, showing up, and just trying to be of service in the world, and also to my children.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's no easy way, but also I just understanding that the people in your inner circle have to be your allies. I think that's something they really get.
Hmm. I think one thing that COVID and the shelter in place has shown a lot of people is how much we do crave connection and community. Because when we are isolated, we go a little bit crazy. So, uh,
What made you decide to do this podcast?
honestly, um, For me, the internet's available. It's cheaper, I guess, than when my parents had it. They I wanted to prepare the next generation.
Right.
So I know from my parents' generation, their way of preparing the next generation was through books, articles, or whatnot. But I'm learning that with my generation and the next generation, the way they consume content isn't always going to be in a book format, but it's going to be through video, it's going to be through podcasts, it's going to be through other means. And so,
Yeah.
if I hand someone your book, they may or may not read it depending on their level of interest of reading. I'm a very big reader. I read your book in 1 or 2 days, but most people don't
Um,
do that. However, if they see this interview and they're inspired by your story and they're inspired by you, they may be more inclined to read the book, even if it takes them 1 or 2 weeks to read. And so, if
right.
nothing else, if they can get some knowledge and wisdom from this conversation, I feel like that's worth this time versus them not having any access to this. And maybe someone watching this has the same challenge that same eating disorder. And if this interview inspires them to go get help, then I think it's worth having that open conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I also like started about a month ago. I always think this is a funny story, which is I was on a panel at Instagram a few years ago, and they were like, you don't have an Instagram, and I was like, yeah, okay. So I had to get an Instagram, and Instagram wrongly, right? I'm like, oh, let me just post a picture of my kid, and so people were like, can you start posting about the talks you give and what you talk about? And I was like, and so a year later, not kidding, during COVID, I started posting video of every day or every few days, and because I do feel like in this time, like that feels very helpful to me. It feels like I'm doing something, and if one person gets something out of a video I post, uh, but I have I've been in recovery or on the recovery journey for 30 years, and I think it's really important that I've been involved in so many organizations, and so I feel like, yeah, I have something to offer, but man, it took me a long time to come to terms with this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And even with YouTube's not going away anytime soon. So if someone sees this video 50 years from now, that's still one person 50 years from now that may go get help for their eating disorder if they're inspired to. Because I think sometimes therapy can be stigmatized, like, oh, that's for the really crazy people, because that's
Oh
tends
yeah.
to be the movie TV show persona. But then when they see that normal successful people struggle with this, then I think it eliminates the shame of getting help. I think you've mentioned shamed a few times.
Yeah. I mean, I remember reading that Puffy was like, he did an article where he talked about how therapy changed his life. And I was like, listen, people, if he can go to therapy, anybody, because it goes against what we're taught. And it feels like a crutch, but it's not. It's this incredible, it is like someone handing you an olive branch
Mm.
in that is going to help your entire life. But I also say to people, they're finding the right therapist is like dating. It may take a moment. The first one may not, you know, it's very, very Goldilocks. First one may be too hard, the second one may be too soft. You'll find your person if you're really committed to healing whatever your childhood wounds are.
Mm. I guess in your opinion, how do how do we get more African American men and women to become therapists and counselors and social workers?
I
What
mean,
would
I think
require
that's happening. I think
that?
that's happening. I mean, there are organizations of Black therapists. I mean, I think it's happening. Like from my point of 20 years ago and today, I think it's happening.
Mm.
I think the same way we have more Black teachers and Black social workers, I think we're also getting more mental health, more Black people in mental health support positions that are there to advocate and to help us.
Awesome. Yeah, I haven't looked at the numbers, so that's why I wanted to ask and see if you knew. So, because it seems like in the movies and TV shows, it tends to not portray that as much. It tends
Yeah,
to be more of a Caucasian, tends to be profession as well. But I'm glad it's shifting.
yeah, I feel
Uh,
like I believe it's shifting.
I guess 20 years from now, with this shift continuing to take place, where do you see society changing? I guess because society, I know there's a lot of chaos right now, but then if with more and more people embracing mental health, do you think that will help society get to a better place with our relations with one another?
I mean, I don't know if 20 years is enough time. I think we're at the precipice of some major change right now. I think things are, and, you know, with the shelter in place and the pandemic, I think people are starting to see that they need more help. It's just like getting them to it, right? Like, how do we find those people who are home, who are on edge, who are struggling? And how do we get them from where they are to the proper support? And if you follow some of the mental health support leaders, there's a lot of Black advocates who are really talking about this. I try and follow every one of them. I'm sure I'm missing some of them, and they're posting every day. So
Is there a fear that people could be giving bad advice when it comes to mental health?
I mean, I think it's like I said about it's like Goldilocks. You got to find the right people. Like I used to hear this saying that I live by, which is when the student's ready, the teacher will appear.
Mhm.
So I think when you're ready, everything gets in alignment. So
Awesome. And I'm sure there's a parent right now that, um, or someone watching that may be that may know someone with an eating disorder. What advice would you give that person who is trying to help someone else that is going through an eating disorder?
I would say, like, there's a lot of support. There's Feast, there's Anad, there's Nita. Um, there are a lot of support groups, right? There's a lot of you know families. Anad is for people struggling who need a community, and Nita is for everything, right?
Mhm.
Like, that's just an umbrella that handles. Um, they have toolkits that tell you how to help people who are struggling. If you're a teacher, if you're a friend, if so, I think between those three organizations, that's a lot of support.
And
And
what,
there's also a lot of the opposite in on social media. People who are committed to you staying sick. So I think going toward people who can support recovery and organizations to find more help,
mm,
because they all list ways that they can.
oops,
Okay, sorry.
no big deal.
So I'm gonna have to go because
No big deal. Super quick for people that want to learn more about you and your work. I guess where can they find you online?
so Stephanie Covington Armstrong.com. That's where I am. I'm also STPHC Armstrong on Instagram. So that's where you'll find me the
Awesome.